Good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing tonight? Welcome, welcome. If you haven't done so already, now would be a good time to either silence or turn off your cell phones. And we're going to get started with our performance right away. It's my honor to introduce to you Kim Smith with Honor the Earth.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kim Smith. Turachitni nishlido titnajini bashishchin. Ashinda shichedo kia ani dashanele. Akut aldine stana nishle. My name is Kim Smith, and I am a Diné woman. And first and foremost, I would like to acknowledge that this is Tongva land, and that we are all on Indian territory, indigenous territory. Although I am not from this community, I am really happy and motivated to see so many people come together to talk about things like climate change, capitalism, or even the current state of what it looks like in this country right now. So thank you all for taking time out of your lives to be here to critically think about what our future looks like. My name is Kim Smith, and I work with an organization called Honor the Earth, and I am a board member. Many of you may know our chief, Winona LaDuke. She is just an amazing woman. And basically, I wanted to welcome you all here and thank you and acknowledge that this is indigenous territory, that it is Indian land. And with that being said, we are doing a fundraiser tonight. You may have noticed when you were walking in that there was a screen printing station set up. We are fundraising for the Winnemem Wintu tribe. And for those of you that don't know who the Winnemem Wintu are, they are indigenous people from California. And the work that they are doing now is to save the salmon. After the Klamath Dam went up, the salmon died at tremendous rates because of the dam. And you can't turn salmon around because they have this ancestral memory of where to go. And so a lot of them died. And so what the Winnemem Wintu did is they took what remaining salmon that they could, and they're in New Zealand now. And what they're hoping to do, and so the Maori people are being caretakers of the salmon right now. But what the Winnemem Wintu want to do is bring the salmon home. And indigenous prophecy, this is something that is very dear to us. Salmon, buffalo, sheep, bees, bats, ladybugs, all of these things that make Mother Earth provide for us. And so we believe that once the salmon come home, then we will know what our future looks like, that we will be okay as human beings. The state that we're in now is not just an indigenous issue, it's a human issue. Think about where our water situation will be like in 10 years, 5 years, 50 years. It's important that if we're talking about environmentalism, climate change, revolution, we have to critically think about when we turn on that light switch, where does that energy come from? Chances are it comes from oil, gas, coal, from indigenous communities. Think about when you turn on that faucet, where does that water come from? If you look at the history of California, we're in a drought. Who knows what's going to happen? And so I urge you to stand with indigenous people, support us as we try and bring the salmon home. That is the primary goal of the fundraiser that we're doing outside. Another part of the resources will go to a woman by the name of Melanie Cervantes, who has been doing amazing work when it comes to revolutionary art. She has produced art to bring indigenous movements, environmental movements to a whole nother level by using her art as a means to do that. And she needs our support because she has cancer. And it comes directly from the environment that she lives in. When you're a person of color, when you're an indigenous person, your chances of getting cancer are much higher. Your chances of having respiratory issues is higher. Your chances of having birth defects is higher. And so we need your support. It's a time for all of us to be accountable to past, present, and future, because our future, the future of our children and grandchildren, depends on it. So once again, I thank you all for being here, and I hope that we all can move forward hand in hand to really overcome what is at stake right now. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelsey Nolan. I am one of the 2 events managers at Skylight Books. On behalf of Skylight Books, Haymarket Books, and tonight's sponsors, Honor the Earth, Climate Hawks Vote, PSR LA, California for Progress, The Leap, The Intercept, and The Nation, thank you so much for joining us this evening. If this is your first time attending an author event hosted or produced by Skylight Books, we're a local independent bookstore located in Los Feliz. The bookstore is a neighborhood landmark, a literary sanctuary, and we're entering our 21st year of life. If you're already part of the Skylight community, you already know how special the store is, and we're grateful for your continued support and dedication. As a bookstore events manager, I have the unique privilege of regularly hosting authors whom I've long admired, respected, and tried hard to emulate. So tonight's a particular honor for me, one in which I get to introduce to you Naomi Klein and her newest book, No Is Not Enough, Resisting Trump's Shock Politics and Winning the World We Need. Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist, syndicated columnist, documentary filmmaker, and author of the international bestseller, No Logo, Taking Aim at the Brand Bullies, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, and This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. She's a senior correspondent for The Intercept and contributor to The Nation magazine. She's also a Puffin Foundation Writing Fellow at the Nation Institute, and her writing appears widely in such publications as The New York Times, Le Monde, The Guardian, and The Guardian. Klein is a member of the board of directors for Climate Action Group 350.org and one of the organizers behind Canada's LEAP Manifesto, a blueprint for rapid and justice-based transition off fossil fuels. In November 2016, she was awarded Australia's prestigious Sydney Peace Prize for according to the prize jury, inspiring us to stand up locally, nationally, and internationally to demand a new agenda for sharing the planet that respects human rights and equality. Joining her tonight is Britt Marling, who is the first person to create, write, executive produce, and star in a dramatic series, and her impressive work is currently exhibited in Netflix's The OA. Her previous credits include The OA, The East, Arbitrage, Sounds of My Voice, and Another Earth. And she recently recorded the audiobook for Naomi Klein's new book, No Is Not Enough, which you're all holding. Here's Naomi Klein.
Hi. Wow. It's so good to almost see all of you. I'm so happy to be here. I want to thank Kim for that beautiful welcome to territory and reminding us of the living systems on which all of life depends and our duties to protect that which protects all of life. I want to thank the wonderful crew at Skylight Books, in particular Kelsey, who you have already heard from. It's wonderful to work with such a fantastic bookseller, an independent bookseller, and thank you for supporting independent bookstores. I also want to thank my publisher, Haymarket Books. I am so proud to be publishing with Haymarket. They publish such authors as Angela Davis, Rebecca Solnit, Dave Zirin, Kianga Yamada-Taylor. It's a truly radical independent publisher, and it's to my great shame that I've been writing critiques of corporate power now for almost 20 years, but I've always published with large corporations. And when I was writing this book, I decided that I wanted to do it differently, and that this is a moment when we need to be building infrastructure for our movements, and that is what Haymarket is doing. So thank you for supporting independent publishing. And I also want to thank everybody who's working on the live stream and acknowledge that this is actually our first sort of real live stream event of the book tour. So you're all here in this room, and there are a whole lot of you, but we're also being joined by lots of people who are watching on their screens at home and hopefully feeling part of this special room tonight. I'm grateful for that territorial acknowledgement. I also want to acknowledge that a lot of people are in pain right now, that these are really, really frightening times, and people of color are being targeted in absolutely outrageous ways. I think today many of you saw this harrowing video, a new video of the Philando Castile murder. I'm going to be in Seattle tomorrow, which is a city in grief because of the shooting of Charlena Lyles, who called the police because she thought her house was being robbed and ended up being shot in front of 3 of her children, a pregnant woman. This is a horror show, and we have to stop it. I'm going to start. I'm going to make some assumptions about this crowd who wanted to show up here tonight, and I'm going to do a short reading from the conclusion of the book. I'm going to make the assumption that you're ready to cut to the chase, okay? And then Britt and I are going to unpack it a little bit. A great many people, myself included, have used the word shock to describe Donald Trump's election and the first months of his presidency, and understandably so. In his first week in office, Trump signed a tsunami of executive orders that had people reeling, madly trying to keep up. Since then, he's never allowed the atmosphere of chaos and crisis to let up. But as I've reflected on the word shock over these months of writing, I started to question its accuracy. A state of shock is produced when a story is ruptured. It's a bolt from the blue. But in so many ways, Trump is not a rupture at all, but rather the culmination, the logical endpoint of a great many dangerous stories our culture has been telling for a very long time. That greed is good, that the market rules, that money is what matters in life, that white men are better than the rest, that the natural world is there for us to pillage without limit, that the vulnerable deserve their fate and the 1% deserve their golden towers, that anything public and commonly held is sinister and not worth protecting, that we are surrounded by danger and should only look after our own, that there is no alternative to any of this. Given that these stories are the very air we breathe, Trump really shouldn't come as a shock. A billionaire president who boasts he can grab women by the genitals while calling Mexicans rapists and jeering at the disabled is the logical expression of a culture that grants indecent levels of impunity to the ultra-rich, that is consumed with winner-takes-all competition, and that is grounded in dominance-based logic at every level. We should have been expecting him. And indeed, many of those most directly touched by the underbelly of Western racism and misogyny have been expecting him for a long time. So maybe the emotion beneath what so many have been calling shock is really, more accurately, horror. Specifically, the horror of recognition that we feel when we read effective dystopian fiction or watch good dystopian film. All stories of this genre take current trends and follow them to their logical conclusion, and then use that conclusion to hold up a mirror and ask, do you like what you see? Do you really want to continue down that road? These nightmare futures are horrifying precisely because they're not shocking, not a break with our underlying stories, but their fulfillment. I've come to believe that we should see America's first nuclear-armed reality TV president in a similar fashion, as dystopian nonfiction. Trump is a mirror, held up not only to the United States, but to the world. If we don't like what we see, and throngs of us clearly do not, then it is clear what we need to do. We have to question not only Trump, but the values and systems that ineluctably produced him. The same values that have been playing out in destroyed safety nets, exploding prison populations, surging white supremacy, normalized rape culture, democracy-destroying trade deals, and rising seas. At the same time, perhaps it's okay, healthy even, for us to be just a little bit shocked by Trump. Here's why. Those stories that produced him were always contested. There were always other stories, ones that insisted that money is not all that's valuable, that our fates are intertwined with one another and with the health of the natural world. The forces Trump represents have always had to suppress those other, older, and self-evidently true stories so that theirs could dominate against so much intuition and evidence. And the persistence of these other stories should remind us that while Trump is the logical culmination of the current neoliberal system, the current neoliberal system is not the only possible culmination of the human story. Which is why part of our work, a key part, is not just resistance, not just saying no. We have to do that, of course. But we also need to fiercely protect some space to dream and plan for a better world. This is not an indulgence. It is an essential part of how we defeat Trumpism. For me, and this may sound a bit strange, Trump's rise has also prompted a more internal kind of challenge. It has made me determined to kill my inner Trump. How about you? Is there anything just a little bit Trumpish worth examining? Maybe it's the part whose attention span is fracturing into 140 characters and that is prone to confusing followers with friends. Maybe it's the part that has learned to see ourselves as brands in the marketplace rather than as people in community. Or the part that sees other people doing similar work to us, not as potential allies in a struggle that will need all of our talents, but as rival brands competing for scarce market share. Given that Trump's presidency is the culmination of corporate branding's insidious logic, perhaps it's time to leave all of that behind. Or maybe it's the part that can't resist joining a mob to shame and attack people with whom we disagree, sometimes using cruel personal slurs with an intensity set to nuclear. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the part that is secretly waiting for a billionaire to ride to the rescue. Except this one will be kind and generous and concerned about climate change and empowerment for girls. The liberal billionaire savior myth may appear very far from Trump, but the fantasy still equates great wealth with superhero powers, which once again is just a little bit too close for comfort to His Majesty of Mar-a-Lago. If some of these impulses and stories seem hardwired in us, it's for a very simple reason. Willingly or not, anyone who consumes and produces media swims in the cultural waters of reality TV and personal branding and nonstop attention-splintering messages, the same waters that produced the Trump presidency. There are different parts of that fetid swimming pool, to be sure, and some people are in zones with no lifeguards and way more waterborne diseases than others. But it is still hard to get genuinely outside of the pool. Recognizing this can help clarify our task. To have a hope of changing the world, we're going to have to be willing to change both the culture and ourselves. And a great many of us are clearly ready for that, for a captivating, transformative vision that lays out a plan for tangible improvements in daily life, unafraid of powerful words like redistribution and reparation, even words. Yeah, you guys are ready. Even words like democratic socialism. And perhaps we should thank Trump for this newfound ambition, at least in part. The shamelessness of his corporate coup has done a tremendous amount to make systemic change seem more necessary. Because if titans of American industry can eagerly line up behind this man with all his viciousness, venality, vanity, and vacuity, and if Wall Street can cheer on news of his plans to let the planet burn and the elderly starve, and if so much of the media can praise his cruise missiles ordered over chocolate cake as presidential, well, then a great many people are coming to the conclusion that they want no part of a system like that. With this elevation of the basest of figures to the most exalted of positions, the culture of maximum extraction and disposing of both people and planet, of grabbing and taking endlessly, is reaching some kind of breaking point. Clearly, it is the culture that must be confronted now, and not policy by policy, but at the root. For decades, elites have been using the power of shock to impose nightmares. Donald Trump thinks he'll be able to do it again and again, that we will be overwhelmed by events, by the Trump show, and will ultimately scatter, surrender, and let him grab whatever he wants. But crises do not always cause societies to regress and give up. There is also always a second option, that faced with a grave common threat, we can choose to come together and make an evolutionary leap. We can choose, as the Reverend William Barber puts it, to be the moral defibrillators of our time and shock the heart of this nation and build a movement of resistance and hope and justice and love. We can, in short, surprise the hell out of ourselves by being united, focused, and determined, by refusing to fall for these tired old shock tactics, by refusing to be afraid no matter how much we are tested, and we will be tested. The corporate coup Trump and his billionaire cabinet is trying to pull off is a crisis with global reverberations that could echo through geologic time. How we respond to this crisis is up to us. Let's choose that second option. Let's leap. Thank you. Now, thank you. I now want to invite out the world's most overqualified audiobook reader, Britt Marling. Britt is so talented, and she has been just a blessing in my life. I discovered that she was reading This Changes Everything, that she'd read The Shock Doctrine and connected with her, and then made this ridiculously chutzpahdik request. Would you read the audiobook for this book that I haven't even finished yet? And she said yes, and did the most magnificent job. And a couple days ago, I was in Portland, Oregon, and some young immigrant rights organizers came up to me and asked me to sign their notebooks because they had been listening to the audiobook and I couldn't sign the audiobook. And they were like, they were saying, she's so good, she even sounds good at double speed. And they're busy. They are doing the most important work organizing. And so the idea that Britt's voice is the soundtrack to revolution as people are doing the actual work organizing makes me unspeakably happy. So thank you.
We're on a clock, and I'm determined to make sure we get to the third part of this book, because this book is divided into 3 sections: how we got here, how things could get a lot worse, but then how things could get a lot better. And I don't know how any of you out there feel, but for me, I'm waking up day to day feeling pretty anxious, so it was really amazing to get to the third section of this book and realize that we're actually in a time in which radical change may finally be possible. So that was really exciting. Can we start by talking about No Logo, which you wrote 17 years ago, which seems sort of unbelievable, because for those of you who haven't read it, No Logo talks about how we are living in a time which is sort of absent of the power of myth, or stories that really encode our morals or ethics or connect us to something outside of ourselves. And in that vacuum, in the 80s and 90s, global corporations sort of swept in, and rather than just pushing products, it became about connecting the consumer with brands. And brands give them access to this mythic sense of meaning. Buy this computer and you will think differently. Wear these sneakers and you will jump like Michael Jordan. I had those sneakers in the 80s because I grew up in Chicago. I don't know that I necessarily defied gravity in them, but that was the idea. Anyway, can you talk about, you talk about in this book how Trump is sort of the ultimate manifestation of this idea of a person becoming the hollow brand. So it would be interesting to hear you talk about that, and also how this sort of makes him impervious to critique, but then also uniquely vulnerable in the way that a brand is uniquely vulnerable.
Sure. Well, I think the way you put it is exactly right, that this whole concept of lifestyle branding, which is a relatively new concept, like up through the 80s, the way it worked was, major American multinationals produced products and then slapped a brand on them to distinguish them in the marketplace and give people a reason to pay extra for it, right? But they were primarily manufacturers or builders, and the marketing was secondary, right? And so what happened is that in the 80s, there was this sort of crisis in the branding world where consumers were getting savvy and they were buying off-label products and going to supermarkets buying supermarket brands. So there was like this. There was what I wrote about in No Logo was this whole angsty period where it was like, is the brand dead? Right? That was in all the business papers. And then along came these new kinds of companies, these hollow brands like Nike, who announced, we are not a manufacturing company. We're not even a sneaker company. We're not a shoe company. We are about the idea of transcendence through sports, right? And you would hire, very high-priced consultants to come find your inner meaning, right? And that meant that you could then fire all your workers and no longer own your factories because your actual work was the work of creating these ideas, these myths, this sense of kind of tribal belonging that was entering into the vacuum left by the fact that many of the institutions that people used to get that sense of belonging from, whether it was religion, tightly knit communities, large workplaces, jobs with some security, all of that was collapsing in this period, right? And so, you wouldn't get what Apple was promising. They were promising revolution, and you wouldn't actually get what you were shopping for when you bought those Air Jordans. But that's the perfect recipe for capitalism, right? Because you're basically unfulfilled as soon as you get the wrapping off.
You have to keep buying.
You have to keep shopping. Yeah. But I always took comfort in that as I was sort of exploring this for No Logo, because what it spoke to was the fact that there is this deep human need for something other than endless consumption, right? And they were marshaling these brands like Starbucks. Their idea was community, the idea of the third place, not home, not work, where we gather, not a coffee company, right? And so as a political person, I thought, well, they're kind of doing our market research for us. Like, people want revolution. Awesome. We'll give them the real thing, to quote Coke, right? But Donald Trump entered into this world of lifestyle branding differently, right? He entered into it late in the game because in the 80s and 90s, he was a traditional builder who just had an endless appetite for self-promotion, but he was still building buildings. And it wasn't until The Apprentice that he became a hollow brand, where he had enough of a platform to build this idea of Trump, where he then could get into the business of just selling his name to other people to build the building. So that's his model. He doesn't build buildings anymore, right? He has a few flagship properties, but his money comes from leasing the Trump name to this cocoon of brands. The thing that makes Trump so difficult to deal with is that he did not appeal to these aspirational sort of progressive ideas that like Nike and Starbucks did. He created this totally amoral brand, and it was tapping into the anxiety in the same period of, okay, the economy has super stratified into big winners and lots of locked out losers, and his promise is, you can be part of the winning team, and we're going to step on as many of those losers, his favorite insult, right? Loser, as possible on the way up, right? So his brand was impunity through wealth, right? And be part of that dream, right? And the more economically precarious the world is, and the greater the gaps between rich and poor.
And playing on the fear of exile or being crushed or not included.
Yeah. I mean, as you know, there's a part of the book about this really this sort of dark turn that The Apprentice took. I mean, it was always sinister, like televised class war. where the first shot of the first episode of The Apprentice is a shot of a homeless person sleeping on the street, and then it pans to Trump in his limousine, and the implicit question is like, who do you want to be, the homeless guy or Trump? But then to get ratings as they went on, they created this sort of refugee camp in the backyard of a Trump mansion. And it was like, the losers were deported and lived in tents, and they would pump in the sound of howling dogs. And the winning team would be living large and dining with celebrities. And so, what's interesting about this is, the reality TV genre up to this point, it's always been televised class war, right? Yeah. It's sort of like put people in these situations and encourage them to turn on each other for a pot of gold.
But
right?
Now it's sort of very explicitly
very
so.
Explicit, because there was always like the pretext with Survivor that it was about something else, like could you survive in the wilderness, or were you a good roommate on Big Brother? But with Trump, it was like, no, this is capitalism now. This is what it's about, and we're going to turn firing people into mass entertainment. So the tricky thing about this is that Trump entered politics not as by playing by the rules of politics, but he entered into politics playing by the rules of branding. And the rules of branding are repeat yourself and stay true to your brand, right? Be brand consistent. And because his brand is about being the boss who gets away with it, every time he gets away with anything, he's reinforcing his brand.
Right.
None of the scandals that get endless coverage on television affect his base because they just identify with him and they just see it as their guy getting attacked. And, if you prove that he cheated on his taxes or, that he's making money off of the presidency at every turn, that's just Trump being Trump. That's Trump being exactly who they expect him to be, and it reinforces it. So that's a problem.
That is a problem, but can you talk about, this was so interesting in the book, the idea of culture jamming, which is something that also came up in the 80s and 90s as this was happening, as a way of sort of penetrating what seems like this impenetrable bubble. I'm sure everybody knows about culture jamming, but one version of that is, the idea of ordering online through the Nike website a pair of sneakers with the word sweatshop emblazoned on the side. So what are the versions of culture jamming that we ourselves could do against Trump to sort of break that myth or be a part of breaking the meme that makes him feel like the winner when he is in fact the loser?
The loser, yeah. You could beat him in an election with a good progressive platform.
That would be great.
That would be the best culture jam of all.
Yes, that would.
I think there are things that can be done to chip away at it, right? Yeah. And it is happening. Comedians are great at it. They understand this very well. The whole President Bannon meme and just anything that presents Trump as a puppet as opposed to the boss. It really, really bothers him, right? I think we've seen the way Steve Bannon has sort of disappeared as some kind of punishment for that. The other way is to go after him where it counts, which is with his brand, going after his brand. In Toronto, my city, it looks like the Trump Tower is going to be de-Trumped because it's going to be really good. It's going to really bother him. And there's more and more of an international move, particularly after the abandonment of the Paris Accord, where it's a kind of a people's sanctions movement. It'd be nice if governments imposed sanctions, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. But in the meantime, there are movements putting pressure on these developers that have the Trump name marring their skyline. And since Trump doesn't own these buildings, they are able to take it off if it starts to become a liability, because the only reason it's there is because it was supposedly adding value. And there's the great Grab Your Wallet campaign, but the problem is that Trump's base fights back, and now they're specifically launching new spin-off brands to profit from their particular base. Like they've announced a new line of hotels called American Ideal, which is it's a 3-star hotel that will be launched in Mississippi, where Trump won by an 18-point margin over Hillary Clinton. So basically, and the Trump boys say they got the idea to launch the American Ideal while they were campaigning with their dad, and apparently the most traumatic experience of their life was staying at a Holiday Inn Express hotel. And they're like, we can do this better. They are cashing in on the Make America Great Again market, and they're using the voter rolls and the election statistics as their market research. Their first partner for the Trump brand is a donor to the Trump campaign. So, I mean, they've completely erased all boundaries between their business, but we already knew that.
Right.
So it is hard to hit him where it hurts because he does have this market and they rally behind him.
Right.
Where I think he's vulnerable is that there is this other brand, which is not the Trump brand. It's this brand called MAGA, Make America Great Again. And that is, he very deliberately created a brand and a slogan, and he's treating it as if it's just marketing. But he's playing with people's lives. And he made some very explicit promises about jobs, about healthcare, about Social Security, and about trade deals, and he is breaking all of these promises, right? He is going to renegotiate NAFTA to make it worse for workers and better for corporations. This is clear. His Commerce Secretary has said this explicitly. And one of the things that pains me most in this moment is that I think we are all inside Trump's reality TV show now.
Yeah.
And we have a media that is addicted to the ratings of the Trump show. And the coverage of the Trump reality show, like, who's being voted off the island now, first it's Comey, maybe Bannon, maybe Trump. I mean, it's the ultimate survivor, right? They can't tear their eyes away. None of them have ever had ratings like this.
Right.
It is not just the right, because it's liberals who are addicted to it too, watching it on MSNBC. And it's providing cover for what would really hurt Trump's brand.
Right.
Because if we were focusing on what he is really doing with healthcare, with how he lied on Social Security, and how he is not bringing the jobs back, and the outrageousness that he's filled his cabinet with, 5 former Goldman Sachs executives after running a campaign about draining the swamp and attacking Hillary and attacking Ted Cruz for being in the pocket of Goldman Sachs. But this is not getting coverage, It's a footnote or it's like a one-day story, but we're not telling this in a coherent way, this betrayal of the MAGA brand. I would concentrate way more on that brand.
Yeah, and this is interesting because you talk about in the book this idea that, of course, it seems very scary that Trump is against everything. I mean, attacking women, attacking immigrants, attacking activists, climate change activists. But this also sort of creates this unique opportunity in that we can sort of get out of our siloed political camps and instead approach things from an intersectional approach and try to all group together. What do you think that looks like? How do we begin to build those kinds of movements when those seem to really require community connectivity and tissue? And of course, the public sphere is something that neoliberalism has been tearing away at for decades now. Yeah. How do we begin to rebuild that glue?
Well, I think it is, and that's exactly the task, right? Because I think people know this, have really felt the limits of silo politics, right? That the people working on climate are working over here, and the people working on racism are working over here, and women's issues over here, and trade over here, and it's very segmented. And there are lots of reasons for this. I think there are funding reasons for it. Where the right really has been systematic in funding a political and ideological project over the past 40 years that is really about changing the values of the culture. But on the left, it's been all about issues, not about underlying values, and not about connections. The Koch brothers have a coherent analysis, and they fund people who are working on this coherent worldview. Make America Great Again isn't, I'm not going to call it intersectional, but it is a holistic view of how to pillage every part of this world and dominate every part of this world, right? The binding tissue is this logic of domination, extraction, disposal, the art of the deal, just getting the most, screwing over people as best you can in every situation. Is winning, yeah. So there needs to be another story to counter that, right? So to me, it's not just about building coalitions. It's also about building stories that connect us, right? And really finding and staying with the different values that we stand for, right? And we need to build institutions. I mean, this comes back to what I said earlier about like why I published with Haymarket this time is we need institutions, we need glue, we need spaces to gather. I was just recently at the People's Summit in Chicago, which was a really wonderful gathering of 4,000 activists. And part of the reason why this happened is because the National Nurses Union, National Nurses United, gifted their infrastructure. They gifted their, they were the glue that brought together racial justice organizers, indigenous rights organizers. I mean, the opening night we heard from people who are on the front lines of the battles in Standing Rock and A Million Hoodies and the Women's March, and it was really beautiful, you know? And I think it does represent an evolution. It's sort of trying to, build a much more multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multi-generational coalition than the Sanders campaign was able to build. But building on that too. I mean, obviously Bernie was, as you know, many of you know that he was the keynote speaker, and a lot of people were like wearing all their old Bernie swag, as if it was, it's like, we're not still in the election. You guys know that. They're like, no. But I think there is an evolution happening, right? And as you know from the book, like I love Bernie, I endorse Bernie, but I think we have to learn the lessons of that campaign on all sides. So, I think the Democrats need to learn the lessons that you don't win by crowding the center and trying to go for the Republican vote. I think they learned it again yesterday. You win by making a real offer. I mean, this comes back to National Nurses United, who have been on the front lines of the fight for single-payer health care in California. Yes. I mean, we're counting on you to be a beacon, right? But we need this. We need institutions like trade unions to step up and help bind us. Because, my generation of activists and yours and certainly people younger have grown up in this age of virtual organizing without those institutions, and virtual organizing is great at getting people together really, really quickly, but it's not great at keeping us together, and it's not great at the strategy stuff.
And to go back to narrative, I mean, one of the things that's so powerful about the book is just the title. No is not enough. It's not enough to say anymore, no, we don't want this world. We have to figure out, how do we describe or articulate what we think the world should look like? And then how do we take steps forward to make that a reality? One of my favorite chapters in the book, and I'll tell you, when I was doing the audiobook, which is the first time I've ever done that, I teared up at this every time, and I had to go make myself a cup of tea and cry into my cup of tea before I could keep reading. And it was this section where you talk about, obviously the Dakota Access Pipeline was being built under the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, and all these people converged to protest. And you talk about the sort of surprise delegation of veterans who came, and that it was very moving to see this group of people who had taken an oath to serve and protect, and who had seen videos of peaceful protesters, being gunned down with water cannons and pepper spray, and that they now felt that the oath to serve and protect was of this group of people, these vulnerable people. And there's a passage in here that just blew me away about, on December 5th, this forgiveness ceremony where hundreds of vets lined up and asked forgiveness of the elders for the crimes committed against Indigenous people over centuries by military institutions they served. And you quote Wesley Clark Jr., who, this is where every time I lost my shit when I was reading. And he said, "Many of us, me particularly, are from units that have hurt you over many years. We came, we fought you, we took your land, we signed treaties that we broke, we stole minerals from your sacred hills, we blasted the faces of our presidents into your sacred mountains. Then we took still more land, then we took your children, and then we tried to eliminate your language that God gave you and the Creator gave you. We didn't respect you, we polluted your earth, we've hurt you, and in so many ways we have come to say that we are sorry." Every time I read that, I was moved, and I think it was because if Trump has created this narrative of winners versus losers, in which the winners take all and the losers get crushed or annihilated, what that chapter represented to me was a new, equally compelling narrative, which is, rather than coming from a place of fear of exile, or fear of being crushed. It's coming from a place of love and the possibility of forgiveness and the honesty of admitting to having caused great harm and taking accountability for that harm. Can you talk a bit about what it was like to be inside that camp and that experience, and why it feels like a critical piece of what yes looks like?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, I think what's so moving about that, I mean, there's lots that's moving about it, but it's so rare in this country and in so many other settler colonial countries to reckon with history, right? Because in the founding myth of this nation and pretty much every settler colonial state is this idea of the reboot, right? Like we're starting over, and we're blanking the slate, right? And you know, if you think about, like, what does it mean to call a place New England? That's really weird, you know? Like,
what was wrong with what was wrong with the name that was there before?
Hey, we found a New England. Yeah. It's bigger and has more trees, and we're just going to, like, start over with the pillage here, you know? And I think that's a part of. I mean, the truth is that you know that this country, I'm dual Canadian and American citizen, but you know that this was all about Europe reaching its own ecological limits, right? And then going on this sort of colonial quest for spare continents,
resources,
right? Yeah. And so I think that's part of what makes it so hard in this culture to look back, why there's just this instant revulsion of, like, you talk about reparation, like, and it's just like, that wasn't me, like, you know, like, we're starting over, like,
but it was you is the thing. Your privilege was built on that. Yeah.
So I mean, that I think that like that power of looking backwards, right, and admitting that we are our history, it's part of healing, and it's also one of the ways in which we become shock resistant, right? I mean, the reason why this country is vulnerable to these types of tactics is because it systematically erases difficult chapters in its history, so we can't learn from them, right?
Because we're like an Etch-a-Sketch. We keep erasing the drawing and starting over.
But I mean, there's this sort of no is not enough. I mean, I was lucky enough to be at Standing Rock when the Army Corps of Engineers denied the permit for the easement. Now, we know that the oil is flowing now, but we also know that a federal court just ruled that what Trump did is illegal in pushing through the pipeline without a full environmental review. So this fight is not over. It's being fought in the courts. It's also being fought at your bank, which is why, if you are invested in one of the major banks that is financing the Dakota Access Pipeline, you should join the Defund DAPL movement and pull your money out of there. But in this moment where there was this taste of victory, right? I happened to be at the home of one of the tribal council members, Cody Two Bears, and there was a gathering of a lot of the sort of key leaders at his house. And they didn't waste 1 minute celebrating. What they were doing was planning, bringing renewable energy to the reservation and turning Standing Rock into a beacon of a just transition to 100% renewables, right? They were, so, I mean, this is the essence of the transition we need to engage in, and for them, it was the no was what would allow the yes, right? It was never the goal, like stopping a pipeline. Yes, you need to stop a pipeline, but that doesn't build the world we need, right? That just
stops the world we don't want. Yeah.
Right, and I mean, this is the whole point of where we are right now. Is if we win every defensive battle, and we won't during the Trump years. The best case scenario is we end up exactly where we were before Trump, which was no safe place, right? Because all of these crises that we're talking about predate Trump, and when it comes to climate change, we're out of time. So we have to do something tricky. Like, we need to figure out how to resist and create simultaneously, right? And that's what Standing Rock. You know, that's what the leaders at Standing Rock were all about from day one. LaDonna Braveball Allard, who opened up her land for the first camp, the Sacred Stone Camp, you know, that this she saw this as a school, right? And learning, like bringing people back to the land, reconnecting with the land. And now there's a whole lot happening now to bring renewables to Standing Rock, and to do it in a way that is bringing skills and jobs to that community, as opposed to doing it in an extractive way. And there are lots of examples of that here in California, of putting up a wind farm on indigenous land and not and basically extracting the land. I mean, you can do renewables extractively without providing skills, training, and barely consent. And there's lots of examples of that. But this is something different that they're trying to do. Yeah.
That's a good thing to talk about. Instead of being on the defense, which it feels like we often are these days because everything the administration does is so shocking that we're just constantly disoriented and reeling, to instead be on the offensive. Like, how do we move it forward? And one of the things the book walks through that was really exciting to hear about is the LEAP Manifesto, which in May 2015 you got together with a group of activists and organizers, and in 2 days, I guess, drafted this first document of the LEAP Manifesto, which is like a people's platform. And I think what was so exciting about reading the sort of bullet points of this manifesto was that it feels that it's the beginning of the creation of a new myth, which is that the people will save the people rather than the billionaire jet set or the Messiah or Obama or any number of political candidates will save the people. Can you talk a little bit about in what kind of whirlwind was this document formed, and what are the key things inside of it? You mentioned care rather than extractivism. Like, how could these ideas ripple out from?
Well, it makes me so happy to think that you had to read the LEAP Manifesto a few times, because I actually put the LEAP Manifesto, the full text, which is not long, it's 1,400 words at the end of the book, and you can also read about it at theleap.org, and we've got a table out front. But yeah, this was this project where 60 movement organizers, theorists got together. We locked ourselves in a room for 2 days, and we did something that we had never done before, which is make space to dream about the world that we actually want, which is really hard, because what neoliberalism is a war on the imagination. It is not just a set of policies like privatization and deregulation and austerity and all of that, right, and hypermilitarism. It's also that there is no alternative to any of this, right? And any idea you could possibly have would be so much worse. And that spell of neoliberalism is finally starting to lift, And the first stage was no, right? And when I wrote the shock doctrine, I thought saying no was enough. And this is part of the answer. I mean, when I wrote the shock doctrine, for those of you familiar with the book, I mean, it's about how in moments of crisis, we lose a whole lot. And in the 50-year history of neoliberalism, it has leapt forward in moments of emergency for societies, right? Where the collapse of the Soviet Union, when people don't have enough food, and their whole country is disappearing, they don't know where they are. That's when economic shock therapy is imposed, right? And I sort of tell the story beginning in Chile in the 1970s, in the aftermath of the coup, where this phrase economic shock treatment is first used, where you do this rapid-fire transformation of a country before people can get their footing, right? And I thought that if people understood that this is a tactic and that I have lots of quotes proving that they know what they're doing and planning it, then people would then sort of be able to resist it, right? And when I wrote the shock doctrine, Alfonso Cuarón, the wonderful filmmaker, made this short little 6-minute wonderful trailer. We call it a trailer, but it's really a short film. It's so good. And the tagline at the end of it was, "Information is shock resistance, arm yourself." Because we thought, well, if you know, then you'll say no, and we'll stop them. And that's not true. That came out in 2007. 2008, the world economy collapsed. And the banks were bailed out to the tune of many trillions of dollars. And then they stuck the public with the bill, and the most vulnerable, most of all, and in particularly dramatic fashion in Southern Europe, right? And all over Southern Europe, people said no, and they occupied plazas, and they stayed there for months. And they resisted with incredible courage. But they didn't put forward an alternate vision for what their economy should look like instead. They lost their nerve at that point, for the most part. And I actually end This Changes Everything with an argument I had with Alexis Tsipras, who's now the Prime Minister of Greece, where he actually said to me, no is enough at this stage. And I said,
No, it's not.
It's not enough. Because what neoliberalism has convinced us of is that, that the alternative to it is apocalypse, right? And so we have to have the confidence in these moments in what our vision is, you know? And I think there's this thing on the left of like, that it might be unseemly. You know, like I remember after Katrina, a lot of environmentalists didn't want to talk about climate change because that seemed opportunistic, you know? I mean, I live in Canada, and we had this horrific fire in Fort McMurray a little more than a year ago. The whole town had to be evacuated. I think many of you probably remember those images of people fleeing, surrounded by flames. It was absolutely awful. Fort McMurray is the town at the center of the Alberta tar sands, and most of the people who live there work in the oil and gas industry. And if you so much as said the words climate change, and this is what is making forest fires worse, as you well know in California, right? You were accused of exploiting this crisis, blaming the victims, and people just went mute, you know? And so we have to have our courage in moments of crisis to both diagnose the problem accurately, because crises are messages. They're telling us there's something failing with the system, right? And we also have the courage to have the courage to put forward the solution, the vision of the world we want instead, because that's when people most need to hear it. And so, so that's what the leap was, is we got together when the price of oil collapsed and went from $100 a barrel to $50 a barrel, and it was a huge economic crisis in Canada because we bet the farm on the Alberta tar sands. Tens of thousands of workers were losing their jobs, and we thought, well, this is the moment to say, this isn't working on any front. You told us we had to choose between jobs and the environment. Now we don't have either. Like, let's figure this out. And so, so the LEAP is a people's platform, and it was drafted with a lot of input from Indigenous leaders who, I think that frame of moving from extraction to a caring, protection, consent-based economy, right, is really at the heart of it. So a key principle is that frontline communities, the communities like the communities here in LA, like the stand communities, and we're going to be hearing more about it later, who have oil drilling in their backyards, in their front yards, whose kids have soaring asthma rates, who are dealing with cancer clusters in their communities, they are owed energy reparation. They are owed energy justice. So the drilling has to stop. That's the first stage. The drilling has to stop. The fracking has to stop. But as we transform where we get our energy from, we have this once-in-a-century opportunity to build a fairer economy and to begin to heal wounds that date back to the founding of our countries. And this is an incredible opportunity. So key principle is front lines, first in line to own and control their own renewable energy projects. Yes. And the other piece of it is, that we recognize the role played by our governments in driving migration, climate change, wars, bad trade deals, mining projects that push people off of their lands, force them to move, and that needs to be reflected in our immigration policies. There also needs to be a spirit of repair in the welcoming of many more migrants and refugees, and in the granting of full rights to all workers regardless of status. But the whole point of it is that we live in this time of overlapping crises, and we just are refusing to play my crisis is bigger than your crisis, right? Climate change trumps racism, racism trumps poverty, whatever it is, like that's how you end up with Trump, Like we come together and we tell another story. And another piece of it that I think really resonated with people was had to do with recognizing low carbon work that is not currently recognized as being part of a so-called green job, right? Because when we think about a green job, we think about a guy in a hard hat putting up a solar panel, and that's all good, and we want to create 1 million climate jobs and all of that. But we also want to recognize that caring for kids is low carbon, and healing the sick is low carbon. And this is work that strengthens our communities, that enriches our lives. It's overwhelmingly work done by women, overwhelmingly work done by immigrant women. It's the most denigrated work in our economy, and we need to invest in it in a major way. And then we also have a whole part about how we get the money for it, an accompanying document called We Can Afford to Leap. But obviously, go where the money is. We live in a time of unprecedented private wealth. Austerity is a failed logic at war with life on Earth, and we just can't accept it anymore. So it's been fun to watch people just pick up this document that came out of this meeting. For me, as somebody who's always written on my own, I was getting track changes from dozens of people. At many stages, I was like, I hate this, and I quit, and I'm not doing this. But what's amazing is that it's so gratifying to just watch the life of something precisely because of the story behind it, right? Like that it came out of this collective process, and that there is this sense of collective ownership over it that you don't have with a book.
And that it feels like the stirring of the collective imagination again, which is, I think, the thing that's been under attack and has been eroding for so many reasons.
I have a question for you, Britt.
Oh?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
All right. All righty, you guys ready? This is a question. This is a question. Yeah, okay. This is a question from my friend, Cecily, who is a super fan of Britt's, as am I. All right, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay.
Cecily?
Yeah.
Good, okay.
Are you a completely normal person who just has this extraordinary ability to imagine and tell these immersive, magical, realist stories? Or are you actually, in some way, partially living in that magical-ish world?
That's a very kind question. Totally an ordinary, normal girl with no access to a magical reality. But I am a big dreamer. I have very vivid dreams. My dream life is an important part of writing. And I think that's something actually inside this book that was very stirring for me, was its call to start dreaming again. And that isn't a fuzzy, soft, weak-willed thing. That's actually something very strong and very powerful, and it's the passion around which we can organize and drive forward and create something new. So I can tell Cecily that it's some version of that. I have a feeling that we together are out of time, but I know that there are some more speakers, so I just want to say thank you for having me here to have this conversation with you, because every one of your books I have read at pivotal moments in my life, and so it meant a lot to read the audiobook, but also to be here and be witness to this evening. So thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Britt.
Yeah.
Very fun. All right. Now, don't go anywhere. Don't go anywhere. We're not done. We're going to be joined by, when you came in, you saw some fantastic tables out front from some local groups. You've heard from some people. You're going to hear from more. I beg of you to stay in your seats, and I'm going to invite up my colleague, Anthony Rogers-Wright, who's the U.S. coordinator for the LEAP, and he is going to take it from here.
Thank you, Naomi. One more hand for Britt and Naomi. That was such a great conversation. So in the book, Naomi, of course, discusses the many ways that the LEAP has taken off in Canada. And I was really lucky. She, her partner, Avi Lewis, and LEAP coordinator Raj Sakura approached me about bringing this idea to the United States. And we agreed that it would be a bold experiment dedicated to making system change inevitable, irresistible, and common sense. And since bringing the LEAP to the U.S., we have been very humbled and honored by the response. From Portland youth who are already working on a draft youth LEAP PDX vision statement to present to their city council, to students at historically black colleges and universities who presented a Just LEAP vision plan to put environmental justice in action, and our most recent project launched today in this great city, City Hall, under the leadership of Councilmember Paul Koretz. Today, with a broad and diverse coalition of local grassroots organizations and community leaders, we announce a climate justice mobilization working group which aims to render the city of Los Angeles fossil fuel free by 2025 through a lens of just transition and intersectional justice. Amazing. Just a quick story. This idea came through a combination of my good friend and brother Russell Green from Climate Mobilization. Russell actually was a Bernie Sanders delegate and introduced the World War II mobilization plan to address climate change in Orlando to the Democratic Platform Committee, which is a very big reason why that platform has some props. So thank you, Russell. You're a beautiful man. I love you. So Russell and Climate Mobilization, and then a chance meeting with Councilmember Koretz's aide, Andy Schrader, while I was in Toronto visiting Naomi and the rest of the LEAP team, and this great work being done by local groups who you are going to, some of them who are going to see, some of them who are here with us today. R.L. Miller, for instance, from Climate Hawks Vote, who got politicians and lawmakers to sign a fossil fuel pledge to not take big oil money. Lydia Ponce from AIM SoCal, who has just been doing such amazing work for indigenous people from the get-go. And my good friend Martha Arguello, who I'm going to invite up now. Oh, she's already on her way, from Physicians for Social Responsibility here in Los Angeles, just doing amazing work. We are so humbled to be able to work with them, to listen to them, to learn from them, and to learn from you as well. So we are blessed. Thank you so much for allowing us to come into your community, to learn and get, to this place that we want to be, get to the yes that we want to be together, because the world that we want is out there and it is ours for the taking. This great city is ready to leap, and we're ready to work with the great organizations who have been and continue to make great strides. So let's get to work, LA. We're looking forward to doing this with you. Thank you so much. In terms of, right before Martha comes up, I'm going to invite Kim Smith back up with some of her colleagues who have an amazing art piece that they're going to display and speak briefly about. And then we're going to hear from Martha, one of the great organizations doing great work. So please welcome back Kim Smith and the crew from Honor the Earth.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you to Naomi and the matriarchs such as Winona LaDuke, who really are in the forefront as women and really show us what true leadership is really like. So thank you. I would also, so this piece comes from a traveling art exhibition that Honor the Earth curates, and it is called The Art of Indigenous Resistance. We just closed the show. It was in Los Angeles for about a month at Self-Help Graphics. If you're local to the area, please go to Self-Help. They do amazing work. And we did the closing of the show on Hollywood Boulevard on Friday. And right now we're working on getting it here at the Archery Museum. But basically this exhibition is going into its fourth year. And it shows resistance art from indigenous communities for the past 30 years. And as you know, women like Winona LaDuke have been really in the forefront of this. And so it's a display of art that shows how we use art as a means to express ourselves, heal, but also raise awareness about a lot of the injustices that are happening in our community. The other thing that I wanted to acknowledge and also say from the bottom of my heart is thank you to all of the people who helped support what happened in Standing Rock. I was there, and it was very powerful to see really what allies and accomplices and comrades look like, and people really came through and showed up. And so from the bottom of my heart, I want to say thank you. Another thing that I want to mention is that Honor the Earth is going to be starting a ride against two pipelines, the Line 3 and the Line 61. We will be doing a horse ride through Wisconsin to say no, that we do not want any more pipelines on indigenous land, that we do not want Line 3, we do not want Line 61, we do not want DAPL, we do not want Keystone XL, we don't want uranium mining through the Grand Canyon, we want Navajo Generating Station to close, we want our salmon to come home. I could go on and on and on, but I really want to, as an Indigenous woman, let you all know that we can, as Indigenous people, we really still need your support. And we thank you for being good allies and accomplices, and we stand with you. And thank you all for your work and for your time. Yahat.
Good evening. Thank you for staying. I'm Martadina Arguello. I'm the Executive Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility and also the... Woo! Thank you. And I have the great privilege of being the co-founder and co-chair of Standing Together Against Neighborhood Drilling. We dreamed that we shouldn't have to live next to oil wells. We dreamed that children shouldn't have to be kept up at night because they had bloody noses, because they were living next to oil wells. We said, this should stop, and people thought we were crazy. You know, that will never happen. We said, keep it in the ground, and people said, you shouldn't say that in public. You're hurting our movement by being so extreme. And I would say, you're not keeping your children up at night because they have bloody noses. You have not developed adult onset asthma. And so Standing Together Against Neighborhood Drilling really came together to give Los Angeles the imagination to say we can rethink this city, we can reimagine it, and we can recreate it, and we can recreate it by unraveling that snake of oil that has controlled our future and controls our lungs and poisons us every day. And Naomi knows, right? When she comes to LA, what happens? Her throat starts to hurt, and last time she was here, she lost her voice, but she did leave with us this great inspiration about the LEAP Manifesto. And in the days and weeks following her visit, everywhere I went, I talked about this. And in South LA, where we are bearing the brunt of oil extraction, where the war economy has left, plumes of contamination where we live and work and play, the idea of leaping to a new economy made perfect sense. Because this economy, this fossil fuel economy, has not helped our communities. It is embedded with injustice. We're extracting value out of the land and out of our people. And so we're committed to end oil drilling in Los Angeles, but we know that that is not enough. We have to transform those sites into productive sites that remind communities that you are beloved. Your lungs are beloved. You are beloved enough that we will stop cancer. And that's what we're trying to do with Stand LA. So we ask you to join us, stand with us. Go to standla.org to learn more about it. Visit the organizations that are here. Leap with us. A future is possible that we control, that we decide what goes into our communities. We at Physicians for Social Responsibility believe in the precautionary principle, that it is better to prevent, right, than to clean up or the mess that we've already made. But also part of that precautionary principle is that the incredible burden of proof that is put on communities because of this broken regulatory system that says we have to show you the harm. How many dead bodies must we show before we actually begin to change things? So we ask you again, visit the groups, support the groups financially, join Stand. We're about to introduce a motion that will give us health and safety buffer zones around those oil drilling sites, and we want to be part of this idea of how do we make a just transition with us, people of color, at the front, repairing the damage that we've done and paying back that debt. So please join us, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Naomi. We're starting a study group to read your new book.
Thanks, everybody.
Really quick, I would like to gift Naomi with this shirt. It says Dear Patriarchy, and we use this as a fundraiser. You can get this shirt outside. You could also get it screen printed on your jacket or whatever it is that you have, but thank you. Here you go.
All right, that's a wrap. Before you go anywhere, if you have a book in your hand and you would like it personalized, we are doing a personalization line out in the lobby to the my left, your right. Or if you want to buy a book, we have more copies for sale in the lobby, and you can go ahead and line up, and we'll get that going here. Thank you all so much for coming, and go talk to the organizations. They're all incredible. Thanks, guys.